Hello, everyone, and welcome back to English 2367. This is me, K-Swizzle, checking in with your Week 4 focus lecture, which you can see is titled Codes of Conduct Self-Branding on Social Media in the 2000s and 2010s. You hopefully have already seen my Carmen message by the time that you are watching this lecture, but unfortunately, I am sickly again. And so I just honestly greatly apologize for the state of my voice. I also am not going camera on for these lectures because I just feel terrible. So I'm going to do my best to get us through this lecture with as much enthusiasm as I can muster, since I really do enjoy the topics that we're talking about. I'm just really sorry to not be able to do them the justice I would ordinarily do of being able to speak in a more animated tone. So without further ado, let's go ahead and talk about the agenda. So there are 4 sections to this lecture, the first of which is from one point to the next, identifying points of connections between weeks 3 and 4. And this is going to be quite similar to what I did in the week 2 focus lecture, where I spent a little bit of time reviewing the readings from last week to pull out some key points, in part to help you as you begin thinking about which of the prompts you might want to work on for response paper number 2. From there, we will cover recapping rhetoric, core techniques for analyzing an argument. And here I'm going to really draw from, as always, what is featured in the textbook, but I especially want to underscore some key techniques that will be especially important for us going into weeks 5 through 8 in the class. So this week in particular will be especially important for making sure that you've got a clear sense of what has been covered in So What thus far. Then we'll talk about terms and conditions, key concepts to add to your analytical toolkit. I anticipate with the state of my voice, I will talk a bit quicker and shorter here, but I have provided sort of the full context for these terms in the slides themselves, in case you want any additional clarification on terms that we're working with from this week on. And finally, we'll cover internet girlhoods in the 2010s, from legacy media representations to digital self-images on social media. And this will be the section where we really talk about the primary sources for this week, whereas in terms and conditions, we're more so covering the secondary sources. So let's go ahead and talk about from one point to the next, identifying points of connection from weeks 3 and 4. And again, we're really thinking about how do these 2 particular weeks build on each other, not to suggest that they don't also build on weeks 1 and 2, but for our purposes going into the response paper number 2 for this week, we're especially interested in thinking about what is it about the materials assigned for week 3 that are beneficial to return to and keep in mind as we work through the material for week 4. So last week's theme, if you'll recall, was slice of life storytelling on social media, personal narratives as artivism, and public education. And the 4 question clusters I offered included: how do mainstream representations of crime and incarceration on television and in film shape public attitudes on prisons and people who are presently or formerly incarcerated? Why is it important that the public read works written by creators on the inside, that is, people who are presently incarcerated? What is the difference between speaking on someone's behalf and elevating their voice? How do creators utilize forms like comics, zines, and art to tell personal narratives? What kinds of visual and verbal techniques are used in comic book and graphic storytelling? And finally, how does using social media to distribute comics, zines, and art potentially influence the creator's form, intended audience, and circulation? So with these question clusters, what I really wanted to get at is thinking about who is telling whose story, right? So of course, in the case of thinking about what we've done thus far of sort of pairing legacy media industries like film and television and radio and advertising with, emergent media forms like social media self-representation, we're able to start thinking about the difference in access to tools, the difference in portrayals, and especially the implications or real world outcomes that arise out of what kinds of representations are available for a particular group that already faces different forms of structural inequities and marginalization, particularly in the United States. Now, this is not to suggest that these issues do not persist also in other countries, but for our purposes, based on the kind of way that English 2367.01 is set up, we're thinking specifically about US culture as kind of our focal point for this class. So with these questions, I really wanted to get at this issue of, in thinking about comics as well as podcasts, how could we look at different forms of self-representation that come through in these mediums? But additionally, how can we think about that for creators who are on the inside, right, who are presently incarcerated? How do they need to or kind of out of necessity, need to find ways to collaborate with or work with creators on the outside to get their message or their content out to the public, right? And as we'll kind of see with this week and focusing on social media influencers, this is of course in stark contrast to people on the outside who don't have to give as much thought consideration to accessing these digital tools in the first place, right? Because we can much more readily open Facebook or Twitter or TikTok or Instagram, whatever platform it might be, and create a profile there where we can really start to dive into creating those self-representations. Now I'm thinking about the articles that you looked at for last week. Of course, one of them was I Draw a Graphic Dissertation, Therefore I Am by K-Swizzle. And I wanted to highlight and come back to this quote that I mentioned in the week 3 focus lecture that I think is especially important in getting at sort of the key concepts or key takeaways from her writing. So she says, the point of comics is to generate new content and meaning through drawing, to use the visual space to think, to map memories, to find patterns, to draw connections, to strategize, to give form to an inchoate idea, to develop a deeper understanding of the topic at hand. Comics, especially graphic memoirs or ethnographies, are an exploration of how one represents information self-reflexively. Something I find myself constantly trying is how to cut down on the textual. On the first draft of each page, I'd ask myself, what can I replace with images? What can I show and not tell? How do I balance the image and the text in a way that each does not detract from the other? The exercise helps me figure out what exactly is necessary for the story and what is extraneous to the argument I'm trying to make. One of the reasons I wanted to highlight and kind of isolate this section of Sohini's writing is because here's where she's really getting at the reasons why comics as a medium is kind of offering these allowances for her or affordances for her that aren't necessarily as possible in written text, right? So as she talks about, of course, we see a kind of academic privileging of traditional research essays as being the key way that we see scholarly contributions being made. But as Sohini is really challenging, especially for people who study comic studies, there's a way that we can understand that the act of drawing a comic about the commentary and critiques that one is making of a comic actually can be a lot more illuminating because you're effectively using the same or similar digital tools or print tools, whatever they might be, to what the creators you're studying are using. And therefore you get a little bit more insight into the actual process of creation. This is also part of my rationale for why you do highlight reels every week, is that after being exposed to various types of mediums and seeing how different creators use those mediums, for me, it feels a lot more useful for you to then sort of think about how could I use a different digital or print medium tool that's going to allow me to reflect on and convey my observations about these texts that if I simply did so in a traditional discussion board post, wouldn't necessarily allow for some of the creative input and just practice that you all are getting with putting those reflections into a different medium, right? And so I think similarly to Sohini's point with highlight reels, we're really thinking about how can we use a visual space in a meaningful way that's going to allow us as readers to really consider how is the argument put together for the secondary source that you're focusing on? How does that secondary source illuminate something in particular about one or multiple of those primary sources for the week, right? But in the process of crafting your highlight reel, how do you effectively, like Sohini, develop a deeper understanding of the topic at hand, right? By doing the process as opposed to just looking at the process and then sort of ultimately producing a written text and nothing more than that. I think also what's really important here is the way she points out that comics allow someone to represent information self-reflexively. By that, she's really getting at the point that when we look at a comic, whether it's physically drawn, on paper or digitally drawn on a tablet, let's say, we can be reminded and be made aware of the presence of the creator in a way that we don't necessarily get with other mediums, right? So even if you look to the right of the screen and see the comic panel created by Sohini, we really are reminded that it's made by someone based on the fact that we can really see each of the lines, each of the geometrizing details to utilize Aldama's language from last week, right? As well as the storyfying details as well. So if the geometrizing details we can understand to be Sohini's profile that she portrays in this panel right here, right, or this box right here, we can understand the storyfying information to be conveyed through these speech bubbles that are supplementing the kind of insight we get from seeing her, right? Because we get to actually see the author based on how she's geometrized herself on the page. But beyond that, the storyfying details provided through these speech bubbles allow us to get even more insight into what it is that she's saying or what she identifies to be the key takeaways from this article. But I think what I especially want you to take away from this article is the point that she's making, that when we're talking about the combination of word and image, or to think back to our week 3 focus lecture, the interplay between geometrizing and storyfying details, or visual and verbal subsystems in comics, what's especially important to remember is that these details should not be repetitive, right? So choosing to represent something in a visual form should mean that that visual form is adding something different or extending or enhancing the impact of the written text in some kind of way. So rather than having them be repetitive by saying or doing the exact same thing, Sohini is helping make us aware that an effective comic is going to pair word and image together in such a way that they complement or complex each other, and also add something different to the overall communication made by that project. Now, with Don K-Swizzle's Prisons and Popular Culture, you might have wondered, like, why are we reading this at the same time as Kei Sohini? It doesn't feel like they're pretty obvious in pairing together. But one of the things I felt is really useful about this article is not only is it a long form piece that will be helpful for us to kind of keep thinking about as we talk about academic writing in the coming weeks, but also I think that the content of Don K-Swizzle's work is really beneficial for us to consider what are the larger implications or impacts of the mainstream representation that we've seen discussed by authors like Ducros et al., right? But how can we really understand and be thoughtfully reflecting on our own engagement with media that might be shaping our impressions of things like the prison industrial complex in ways that we don't even realize because it's so embedded in our entertainment media, right? And so in a lot of ways, the Prisons and Popular Culture article builds on the contributions made by the Huffington Post video that we watched for last week that touched on the overrepresentation of Indigenous peoples in the prison system, as well as I think it does a really nice job of also talking about stereotypical portrayals, as we saw in the Asian American and Pacific Islanders on TV article, and really tasks us with considering what harm is enacted through seeing repetitive stereotypes and exaggerated entertainment media about people on the inside. And in thinking about the harms that are caused by media, this also links us to Sophia Umoja Noble's article in thinking about social media as post-traumatic technologies of terror. And so in my mind, this article really draws some connective tissue between multiple texts that we've looked at thus far. Sorry, I keep clearing my throat. So with this in mind, I wanted to draw our attention to kind of the final section of Cecil's article, where she really dives into the contemporary moment of prison media that I think is really important. Here's where she says, modern prison imagery is easily accessible and diverse. However, it is also formulaic. There is a reliance on shock and violence, which ultimately supports current incarceration policies. This formula is a part of mainstream prison imagery. The underlying message, is that prisons are a needed and effective crime control method, which should focus on deterrence and incapacitation. Prisoners are defined by their crimes, which are typically violent and cast as very different from the viewers. The othering of prisoners seen in films is used throughout these mainstream images. According to Mathieson, the media's continued focus on those convicted of violent offenses inherently offers the suggestion that prison is the only solution to the crime problem. This type of repeated imagery has the potential to leave viewers scared, shocked, and in favor of retributive crime control policies. These messages are the fuel of penal populism, which has been argued to be at the root of modern imprisonment policies. So what she's getting at here that I wanted to kind of highlight before we move into this week's materials is that similarly to what we kind of see come up in Trevor Buffoni's chapter for this week of the dismissiveness one might have for TikTok as a platform in saying, why does it matter? It's just TikTok. What happens there is inconsequential. Don K-Swizzle's article is positioning a similar argument in the sense that she's positing that mainstream media that portrays prison media or depicts the prison in these shocking and violent ways, right, are contributing to the public's acceptance of the prison system in its current configuration. And what she's kind of getting at here is that by repetitively showing us the same image, right? And implying over, or I really should say kind of explicitly stating over and over again that people who are presently or formerly incarcerated are hyper violent or non-human or deserving of crime and punishment, kind of being linked in the prison system in the ways that it currently is, right? What Cecil is getting at is that this then starts to transform public attitudes towards the prison system and creates the idea that the only way to respond to instances of crime is to put people in prison. And what she's getting at here is, what might it mean to trouble this portrayal and instead say, what are some of the alternative approaches that could be taken and that could also acknowledge the various structural reasons that oftentimes contribute to why someone perhaps commits a crime that then kind of leads them into this prison system that is set up to not be for their rehabilitation, right? And so she's really arguing then that even though we see prisons represented constantly, no matter what you're watching, whether it's television, film, reality TV, whatever it might be, and as I kind of, think is important to acknowledge as well, might be in temporary ways, like in one episode of a show, or in more substantial ways, right, of like an entire show being about it. Either way, we can really see that we're constantly shown this image of prisons, but we aren't necessarily encouraged to confront why they exist in the first place. And so Cecil is calling for us to be critically aware when we see the image of prisons on our screens so that we can start to question, what is this entertainment media implying or sort of normalizing and suggesting that we should not confront? All right, so we're going to go ahead and move on to recapping rhetoric, core techniques for analyzing an argument. So something that I wanted to emphasize from the reading for this week is the way that the reading is setting us up to utilize the terms inspiration, purpose, and implications in our analytical toolkit moving forward. And these are terms that are hopefully already familiar to you in some capacity, but I think noticing how they are applied in this chapter is really helpful for when we move into next week's discussion of the research proposal for the semester research project. So these three terms of inspiration, purpose, and implications are really presented for us by the authors as a way of thinking about, why do scholars write? And ultimately, how do they determine that they want to invest the time, energy, care, and labor that goes into crafting an argument, right? So they're really highlighting three facets of this process that are incredibly important, and that we as readers, in being attentive to them, can also gain a bit more insight and understanding as to why they are guiding or how they're guiding the project in the ways that they are. So with inspiration, we're talking about the scholar is writing because they're responding to some problem, question, or gap in understanding. And so with inspiration, this is really getting at, there's an ongoing scholarly conversation of some kind, and the scholar is choosing to enter that conversation based on something that has inspired them, whether it's a problem that they want to solve, perhaps there's a question that's piqued their interest, or even there might be a gap in understanding or a way that the scholarly conversation has talked about topics, texts, or issues up until now that are missing or overlooking something that now the scholar is contributing themselves. With purpose, we're thinking about, in knowing that if the inspiration is the cause of the argument, then the purpose is its desired effect, what the writer hopes the argument will accomplish, right? So before now, you've definitely heard me say that an effective argument is going to be designed in such a way that the audience is compelled to listen to and accept the argument being presented by the author. And so purpose is really what's guiding that principle, right? It's thinking about what is sort of excuse me. It's thinking about, what is really kind of influencing how the author is trying to craft an argument, and what it is that they want to achieve by doing this, right? So they're not just writing an argument for nothing, but instead, how is their purpose really guiding the kind of why of the why it's created? And how does this why also influence things like the writer's decision as to what genre they're going to choose, the style, the formatting, and how they ultimately create the argument, right? And so, for example, they give this hypothetical that if writers want to influence public opinion, and that's their purpose, they may write an editorial using clear logic and engaging prose. We can think about another example as being, for example, if a writer wants to educate the public on something, but they specifically want to address other people who are within the university system, they're more likely going to publish their work in an academic journal or academic monograph or editorial collection, as opposed to having a public facing text, right? Whereas if they do want to address the public and have what's kind of known as a popular press publication, then they would be writing in a capacity such as a newspaper article or magazine article, that sort of thing. Now, implications reflect the larger outcomes of an argument, the indirect and unforeseen consequences that go beyond its immediate purposes. So we want to consider an everyday example that ties these elements together is what they give us. Suppose some citizens become irritated about teenagers speeding through their neighborhood, which is the inspiration. So they write a letter to the editor of their local newspaper to raise awareness of the problem. That's their purpose. And after reading the published complaint, the chief of police sends a patrol car to the neighborhood to set up a speed trap, or that's the implication, right? Now, definitely prior to this slide, you will have heard me use the term implication in the sense of, even in my previous conversation about the readings for last week of, what are the implications of or the outcomes of mainstream media representation that fails to provide a nuanced representation of Asian American and Pacific Islander communities, or fails to provide a nuanced representation of people on the inside of the prison industrial complex, right? So implications is really getting at what are the outcomes created by an author really sitting down to pursue that inspiration for their argument and ultimately determining why and how they're going to create this argument to achieve their desired effect. So this then should remind us of the rhetorical situation that we already saw in week 1. And the authors remind us and kind of synthesize it as, inspiration reflects the writer's motivations, which often arise from the context, which the context, of course, is going to be our larger circle that really encapsulates everything in the rhetorical situation. Purpose is usually embodied by choices of content and design, especially genre, right? And so purpose is going to be inside of this triangle, and implications are associated with the audience and effects of the argument. So it's going to be the section right here. And so I do have a more detailed annotated version of this rhetorical situation in my week 1 focused lecture. But for now, I just want to remind us that within this relationship of the rhetorical situation, the audience is, of course, making meaning from reading the author's argument. And the author is making meaning from writing this argument. But in order to even make meaning through this argument that they're preparing, right, they need to first be inspired by something in regards to the larger context and ultimately have a purpose that's going to really encapsulate or guide how and why they're making the argument that they are. All right, so the authors tell us then that some of the steps that we're going to want to take when we're analyzing an argument are going to consist of identifying the audience and context, as well as identifying the author and inspiration. And I'm going to talk through these relatively quickly. But with audience and context, we want to notice details like the argument's publication information, which is where and when it was originally published, which we're going to spend a lot of time on with the literature review in this class. We want to do this in part to help us identify the audience and understand the larger context. And so, we want to really think about, where was this published? When was it published? What format is it appearing in, right? Who is the audience based on the location of this publication? And how does this give us some insight into, who it is that the writer is ultimately trying to address? Now, with identifying the author and inspiration, this is also going to be a point at which we want to think about what are the credentials or what is the credibility for these authors whose argument we are potentially taking as insightful and therefore compelling for us to accept, right? And so we want to think about, are they experts in their field? Does the author have a career or place of employment that really, is related to the types of arguments that they're producing, right? Are they publishing regularly on this topic? In essence, what are the patterns that we can notice or kind of use to associate the writer with their credibility or their credentials, right? And this is also going to help us then to think about how does a writer perhaps share with us the inspiration for their argument in the course of what it is that they are writing. I hope that you especially pay attention to this notion of authorial inspiration in the Trevor Buffoni chapter for this week, where you can really see the first few pages of the D'Amelio effect be about Trevor Buffoni communicating to us what inspired his interest in TikTok, and in particular, what inspired his interest in Charli D'Amelio as a content creator. And then they move to identifying the contents of the argument, right? And we'll talk about this at length next week, but they give us sort of these helpful building blocks, right? That we'll want to identify the thesis, identify the support, and identify the rationale, all of which is going to ultimately be combined to produce an argument that's ideally effective and compelling to the reader. And so when we're identifying the thesis, this is going to be the central argument communicated by the author or authors, and is going to really be sort of the foundation upon which the argument is advancing, right? So without a thesis statement, it can be a bit tricky as a reader to really understand where an author or authors are pointing us to, or what they're moving towards in terms of a goalpost, if we don't have a clear sense of sort of what is the organizing thesis that's really grounding the argument that they're proceeding to make, right? And so having a thesis of usually 1 to 2 sentences is going to ensure that we have a roadmap of sorts that helps us to understand what exactly it is that the reader or that the author wants the reader to get out of the reading experience. Additionally, identifying support should remind us of the bridge image that we've already been presented in So What. But when we're thinking about support, right, this is really where we're going to be understanding kind of the body of the argument, or kind of the middle of the paper, to be making a contribution to the overall argument, right? And so in order to really fulfill on the promises made by the thesis statement, you need enough substantial support that's going to really allow for the reader to see how you're following through on the argumentative claim presented by the thesis. And additionally, related to the support, of course, we have the rationale, which we also saw in the bridge image earlier in So What. And with the rationale, we want to think about, how is the author ultimately not only supporting the argument that they're making, right, and support taking the form of evidence, verification, and or illustrations, but with a rationale, we're going to want to look for places where the authors connect their statistical findings with their claims. So it's almost like a full circle moment, that if the thesis is sort of the central foundation upon which the argument is built, the support is allowing us to take a few steps forward to see how the author is supporting their argument. And with the rationale, they're ultimately making a point of connection between the evidence they've presented and how the evidence connects back to the thesis that they are providing us with. This takes us then to identifying the purpose of the argument and identifying the implications. So in understanding that the thesis is the main point that the writer attempts to support, whereas the purpose is the desired outcome of an argument, usually how the writer wants to change the audience's understanding, beliefs, or behavior, we can understand then that we need to be able to distinguish between what it is that the author is arguing and what it is that the author is trying to accomplish by making that argument, right? So we have to kind of hold both things simultaneously. And we'll talk about this next week of when you're putting together an argument, you not only want to be able to establish this is what I'm arguing about this text that I'm attending to, but you also want to be able to communicate to the reader, what is it about this argument that is really kind of driving or guiding this project forward, right? So in essence, like, what is it that you're trying to achieve by spending all of this time putting together the argument that you are? Are you trying to change the public's attitudes towards, let's say, TikTok as a social media platform? Are you trying to change the public's attitudes towards the robust content creation and scholarship that's conveyed through comics as a medium, right? Et cetera, right? And so that's really getting at the larger purpose as opposed to the more minute details of the argument being presented by the author. Now with the implications, As the authors note here, a scholarly argument's implications may be stated or implied, which means that they might either be explicitly made clear to us that we know for sure what the implications are, or sort of the long-term effects or the outcomes of this project, or they might be implied that we need to do a little bit more digging to be able to understand where exactly they exist in this work, right? And so depending on the project, right, we may find them in the conclusion as being a way similar to thinking back to and returning to the last slide of what the rationale accomplishes with the support. In some respects, implications almost act like a rationale to the purpose as a kind of support, but we'll get back to that kind of next week. I think perhaps the most useful section of the chapter for this week is table 5.2 that's titled Identifying and Interpreting a Scholarly Argument's Components. Reason being, they break down everything that they just talked about into a really clear and concise visual table. And in doing so, I think what they do really well, the authors, is they take the information, and kind of similar to what we've talked about in terms of, word and image. In some respects, they're using the table as an image, though it does sort of restate the information that we've already seen. They also reorganize the information in such a way that it's a little bit clearer to understand. And I do recommend printing this table or saving it, because I think that it does a really nice job of providing us with the guiding questions that we really need to have in our back pocket in order to really identify each of these elements in a writing. But beyond that, they provide some useful suggestions of where potentially this information can be located in a scholarly argument. And we'll return to this when we get to the literature review in a few weeks. Let's go ahead and move to terms and conditions, key concepts to add to your analytical toolkit. So this is going to really be the portion of the lecture where I'm engaging with the secondary sources that we read for this week, and also pairing concepts from those secondary sources with some secondary sources and excerpts from other chapters that we didn't have the opportunity to read to give us a fuller context or understanding of this topic of thinking about social media influencing, okay? So in thinking about this week, right, and kind of considering some of what the readings for this week are really presenting to us, which I'll dive into more in the primary source section of this lecture, what I really wanted to make sure was the case with this section of the lecture is that we could really have a working vocabulary of some of the terms that are useful when talking about what it means to be a social media influencer, but also what it means for the average person to present a public self online through their social media presence. And one of the ways that can be helpful as a point of entry to this topic is Sarah Benet Weiser's concept of broadcasting yourself, which she of course utilizes from YouTube's original slogan, in which they portrayed the platform as being about broadcasting yourself to the public. And so in her conception of this phrase as a concept, Benet Weiser tells us that broadcasting yourself is also a way to brand oneself, a practice deployed by individuals to communicate personal values, ideas, and beliefs, using strategies and logic from commercial brand culture, and one that is increasingly normative in the contemporary neoliberal economic environment. Additionally, public self-expression and self-branding are validated by the cultural context of post-feminism, which among other things connects gender empowerment with consumer activity. The ideals and accomplishments of the post-feminist subject, independence, capability, empowerment, are also those that define the neoliberal subject. These in turn are supported and enabled by similar ideals and assumptions about the contemporary interactive subject, who realizes her individual empowerment through and within the flexible, open architecture of online spaces. So with this excerpt, what we're really getting from Sarah Benet Weiser, and she's thinking specifically about girls on YouTube in the 2010s and the late 2000s, she's pointing out that through this practice of broadcasting oneself by, posting videos to YouTube, right? What girls of various ages are able to accomplish is the creation of a public self that, of course, is available and visible based on, how it is mediated through the YouTube platform, right? So the convergent video player that makes it possible that from anywhere in the world, someone else could see the video that is posted, so long as the privacy settings are set to public. But nevertheless, what she's really getting at here is that simultaneous to the moment that a girl decides to upload a video, let's say of, dancing with her friends and doing some sort of like cover of a song or dancing to a song, which was often very popular in the late 2000s on YouTube. In doing so, what they simultaneously are achieving is also the creation of a self brand or a branded self that very much is kind of the the entertainment that is being provided by this content creator to their audience, right? So whereas some later internet celebrities become famous based on singing covers or become famous based on, some sort of talent or whatever it might be, right? At the basic level of broadcasting yourself, Bené Weiser is positing that each time that someone is uploading a video of themselves to a site like YouTube, what they're effectively doing is starting to create a brand where their audience comes to develop certain expectations about what that creator is going to do, how they're going to behave, how the self-expression that is coming through in that video is communicating something about their persona or their beliefs, right? And so instead of perhaps like logging onto a platform to watch a movie or a television show, instead by broadcasting yourself, the girl effectively becomes a brand of her own, right? That she's sitting in front of the camera on her laptop or her phone or whatever it might be, is the brand that's driving the overall channel that audiences are coming to watch. I know this is probably going to sound pretty straightforward and obvious based on your own familiarity with platforms like YouTube, right? In the 2020s, everyone is pretty familiar with how these things work. But it's important for us to kind of start here because this is a really foundational way that media studies scholars have talked about social media since the 2010s as a more recent media form, and one that's really creating this possibility that by deciding to make yourself visible and effectively broadcasting yourself from anywhere, whether it's your bedroom or outside or wherever it might be, right? There's the possibility that girls in particular, who, like other populations, don't necessarily always achieve nuanced representation in mainstream media, have the opportunity to feel a sense of independence or capability or empowerment based on the fact that they are the ones holding the camera and they're deciding to some extent on what terms they are visible to the public, right? And so in doing this, right, it creates the possibility that being online can be empowering for girls, that they get to create media of their own. And in creating this media, they're simultaneously having to navigate the pressures of a larger brand culture that expects there to be sort of this overarching focus on monetization, on advertising, on corporate branding, which eventually Bené Weiser argues is what the girls uploading videos to YouTube are being kind of moved in the direction of. So this leads us to this term of self-branding, right? And so she says that the self-branded girl is encouraged to be self-reliant and empowered, especially within a consumer context. Indeed, she is encouraged to be a product within a neoliberal context. She authorizes herself to be consumed through her own self-production. And she goes on to say, commercial brands structure narratives for YouTube videos, and there's an online life linked to the culture of branding. So what Sarah Bené Weiser is getting at here is that through the act of uploading videos to YouTube, right, a girl is creating a self-brand that, the product that's being marketed or mediated or presented to the public is herself doing whatever activities or hobbies or whatever it might be, right? But within the logic of neoliberalism, what this means is that girls then are encouraged to perceive that by getting, responsiveness from the public on YouTube, whether it's likes or comments or views or shares, right, that they're encouraged to understand this to be the ideal form of empowerment, or sort of the most ideal way that they can achieve a visibility in popular culture that they can then leverage into a more substantial type of authority, agency, and power, right? And so the idea then is that instead of perhaps pushing for other forms of liberation, instead, Sarah Bené Weiser is positing that girls are encouraged to perceive of their online presence as being the ultimate way that they can achieve power and feel empowered in their self-image, right? That their image is the end all be all of what it means for them to have any type of power in US society. Now, the reason why this is important is because this framework really encourages girls then to put the majority of their time into thinking about and kind of really intentionally designing their online self that's mediated through a platform like YouTube in such a way that it's palatable to their audience, that their audience wants to keep coming back, right? So it really creates this kind of pressure of, on the one hand, oh, this is fantastic. I suddenly have people who are listening to me or paying attention to me, and I'm able to present myself and be visible on my own terms. But at the same time, girl creators are having to be conscientious of, what shows up in the algorithm, what is getting the most engagement from their viewers, and how are they ultimately changing their self-image and creating a version of it that functions more as a product than as a person, right? That they're offering this product to their audience. And so Bené Weiser says that developing a self-brand on commercial social networking sites such as YouTube means that girls reference brands not simply as commodities, but as the context for everyday living. Even more specifically, this branded context for living supports practices by which individuals craft identities as products capable of catching the attention and attracting demand in consumers. These self-brands, the self as product, on the YouTube videos I examined, rely upon and validate post-feminist practices in which particular narratives that connect individual empowerment and creativity with gendered consumption practices, such as displaying the hypersexualized body, particular beauty practices, and performances of stylized heterosexuality, are repeatedly circulated in ways that support normative gender relations rather than challenge them. So what Bené Weiser is saying here is that girls are encouraged to think about the way that they achieve this visibility online is in part by aligning themselves with a branding culture, right? A great example of this is beauty gurus. So beauty gurus on YouTube in the 2010s really effectively achieved their visibility by creating makeup tutorials and doing haul videos of products that they purchased from stores like Ulta or Target or Bath and Body Works. And in doing so, through their consumption of these products by way of reviewing them, testing them out, educating their viewers on how to apply them or use them, right? They're effectively aligning themselves with branding culture by situating themselves as a product of a reviewer or a beauty guru who effectively creates content or creates a public self in part by consuming products that other people want to watch them consume, okay? And so what Bené Weiser then is arguing is that this type of visibility, while it does allow individual girls to achieve optimized power, right? More followers, more of an online presence, potentially have more career opportunities beyond YouTube. At the same time, it's also restricting them to a certain kind of visibility. And that visibility is really predicated on them maintaining a look, maintaining a persona, and maintaining a kind of consumption practice that really situates them as needing to perform a kind of normative beauty or normative girlhood, right? And in the US, that's going to look typically like cisgender, heterosexual, white, able-bodied, neurotypical, white, I think I already said white, but girls, right, who are performing these gendered practices or these gendered behaviors that we typically associate already with girlhood. Applying makeup, getting dressed, shopping, right? And so what Bené Weiser is arguing is that the logic of self-branding has a power associated with it, that some girls can use it to sort of achieve more social capital or economic capital in society, meaning that they can acquire more wealth, they can acquire more social status, right? But at the same time, they are really restricted or pigeonholed into performing one type of beauty or one type of girlhood or femininity, that if they diverge from that, they're going to get pushback from their audience. The flip side of this then is burnout. So if we think about self-branding as being a process by which the girl creator is really encouraged to spend all of her time, care, energy, and labor in laboring for her public image, through which she can possibly achieve an increased visibility, more wealth, and more social status, or a higher social status, burnout is the reverse of this, right? And this is a type of ongoing exhaustion that occurs in response to prolonged stress, often a feeling of being emotionally drained and overwhelmed to the point of immobility. Burnout can generate feelings of self-doubt, lack of motivation, disinterest in activities, helplessness, negativity, and inability to feel accomplished when completing tasks. It is also an example of struggling with mental health that can also translate to temporary physical health struggles such as a lack of energy. Burnout is often connected to labor production and professional career pursuits, though it can be intensified by other stressors such as social media and the expectation that a creator of color, particularly Black creators, immediately and consistently provide content that addresses systemic issues when they get mainstream news attention. So one of the reasons I wanted us to touch on burnout is not only because we continue to live through and labor through a panini, but also because burnout is a really important facet of the conversation of the pressure to labor in a capitalist society. Reason being that as you may have experienced in your own process of navigating school since 2020, and even maybe before that, burnout really is this issue of being forced to continue moving onwards, right? Or continue laboring, even if you are not feeling well. Maybe me giving this lecture is a good example of this too, right? Of the sort of structural pressures and structural forces that are in place that mandate that we make a contribution to capitalist society, regardless of our wellness. And in a lot of ways, burnout also can be the outcome of things like being pushed to be a perfectionist, being pushed to achieve at high levels consistency. And burnout can really be the reverse of self-branding, right? Because if we understand self-branding to be a process where girl creators in particular are being pushed by the YouTube platform and their audience and even themselves to really continually and consistently achieve these high levels of engagement so as to sustain their online self and persona, that can quickly culminate in burnout because you're really trying to labor at a level that's not possible for a human. Because in branding culture, we can understand that, a product that is not a person, like, I don't know, a soda or a candy company or whatever it might be, right? An object or something that is not human, that can be consistently churned out to us at a level that doesn't necessarily have the same regard for wellness, even though there are people on the other side of that process maintaining that consistency, right? But human beings aren't able to be consistent in the ways that a practice like self-branding mandates. And so that can really create this type of burnout or this feeling that it's really impossible to move on. Additionally, and I'll kind of expand on the article that you see referenced on the right side of the screen in my next slide, but we can also see a type of burnout really kind of specific to Black creators on platforms like TikTok, for example, a little bit on YouTube, but especially on TikTok, I would say. That if we think back to the uprisings that happened in 2020, when George Floyd and Ahmaud Arbery and Breonna Taylor and many other unarmed Black folks were murdered, we really saw a kind of push that there was an expectation from non-Black content creators and audiences that Black creators should provide some kind of insight or educational resources or personal experience to supplement their own understanding of what was going on. And not only is this challenging because Black creators do not owe their audience anything, including any types of personal experience or discussions of trauma that they don't want to provide, right? But also this creates this issue of when we have this periodic focus on certain traumatic topics in mainstream news, there's also a pressure put on creators that they should create content because it will not only get them engagement, but it's also sometimes this sensation of the nation cares about this right now, therefore I should create content to educate people while they're paying attention. We can see a kind of example of this also in the current discourse that's happening about gun control, right? That for folks who are really critiquing the existing gun policies that exist in the US that make accessing guns a lot easier for folks, that can then culminate in acts of violence like we've seen numerous examples of in the last 2 weeks. Creators who post about or talk about gun reform, for example, may feel a pressure to get more content out in these last few weeks to sort of match the public attention to this topic before it dissipates as it has so consistently done. I wanted to also include this post by Hello, My Name is Wednesday, who's a queer disabled creator on Instagram. And their art here, there's two examples. One on the left says you have reached a mental health checkpoint, and the one on the right says burnout is real, so go slower, take it easy, you need rest too. And I wanted to include these two because for the left, something that Hello, My Name is Wednesday does is they put these mental health checkpoints in Instagram Reel format on their platform. And so as you're scrolling through Instagram, periodically you'll see these posts, and it's these sort of calming, relaxing animated videos that are guiding you through remembering to take a breath, maybe unclench your jaw, drink some water, right? Giving you some helpful reminders, especially if you're in the habit of doom scrolling or kind of scrolling for long periods of time on social media when you feel panicked or anxious about something. On the right side of the screen, the burnout image, which is a static image and is kind of a standalone graphic that they created. I also wanted to include this to say, and I of course wrote these slides before I felt as terrible as I currently do, I wanted to just also take a moment to say, I know I don't have you in person this semester, but I just want to express that I really care about you as a person, as well as, of course, as a student. But in my mind, you as a person always matters more than you as a student. And I wanted to include this graphic to really say that if you presently are experiencing burnout in any capacity, whether it's in terms of what's going on in the world right now, whether it's in terms of personal life struggles that you're facing, whether you are struggling with depression and anxiety like I struggle with, I just wanted to take a moment to say that your experience is very valid. Your anxieties and stress are very valid. And if you are experiencing burnout and there's ways that I can be of support to help you navigate this class to make space for more rest, please don't hesitate to reach out. Because I think that your mental health is so, so important, but the university system, much like self-branding and social media influencing, really pushes us all to labor at levels that are not necessarily sustainable. So this then relates to, so talking about burnout connects to these terms of elevate and amplify. And these terms generally refer to the process of centering, raising, or emphasizing someone or something to a higher position of significance in a given space. They can also be applied to describe the foregrounding of an individual, group, or community's contributions to society at large, a professional industry, social media platform, or culture as legitimate or desirable. Consistent throughout these spaces is the structural privileging and overvaluing of white voices regardless of merit, whereas Black voices are erased, culturally appropriated, and undervalued, even when their content creation is the foundation of a platform or white creators' professional success. And this is something that Trevor Buffoni's chapter, I think, really digs into meaningfully. And so when we're talking about elevating or amplifying voices, right, what we mean here is thinking about, how do we intentionally recognize and consciously grapple with recognizing that if mainstream media representation and social media platforms both contain really problematic patterns of elevating and amplifying white creators or white performers over marginalized creators, we want to be really conscientious then of how is it in discourse, in community spaces, in content creation that we're following, right? How are we consciously working to elevate and amplify the voices of the marginalized creators who experience discrimination like shadow banning, which Callie Middlebrook, of course, talks about in her respective article. But I really like this article from Callahan Rosenblatt from NBC News in 2020, which is titled From the Renegade to Black Lives Matter, How Black Creators Are Changing TikTok Culture. Because in it, she writes, but TikTok sits uneasily at the intersection of viral social media, celebrity, and activism. The platform has long been accused of elevating white voices over Black voices. While Black creators have been integral to the rise of TikTok, some of the most popular dances, challenges, and trends were born in the imaginations of Black TikTokers. Their work hasn't always gotten the same level of attention as that of their white peers. And I think this point is a really effective lead-in to thinking about the contributions that Trevor Buffoni makes in his own work on TikTok. I do have to pause really quick to cough. I'm so sorry. I'll be back in a moment. All right, so I'm going to try to cover the remaining slides in this section best I can. I do encourage you to read them at length because I won't have the voice strength because of my sore throat to read them in the ways that I'd like to. But key points, here we go. So overvalue of white creators is something that Trevor Buffoni is really interested in his work on TikTok. Particularly, I think he does a great job of introducing this issue in his initial book on TikTok, Renegades, Digital Dance Cultures from Dub Smash to TikTok, in which with this first quote, he establishes that really, when we're talking about a creator like Charli D'Amelio, virtually anything she posts will go viral. Her actions dictate the actions of millions of TikTok users and by extension, an entire generation of young people on and off the app. Now, this is probably not surprising of a take, right? Because we can definitely see some similarities in how TikTokers, of course, their careers mirror in some respects the careers of traditional celebrities like movie stars, TV stars, and so on, right? That the actions that they take as celebrities can then trickle down into how that generation perhaps dresses, behaves, etc., right? But he kind of advances on this point in the book chapter that we read for today, which is from TikTok Cultures in the United States, in which he argues that, of course, many people disregard the racial politics of TikTok. When controversies arise on TikTok and Instagram, the comment sections swell with many social media users writing that it's just TikTok, it's not that serious. And I briefly mentioned this point earlier in this lecture. Now, for Buffoni, what he's getting at here is that when we talk about TikTok as a platform, there is the kind of inclination from some people to argue it's just TikTok. We don't need to worry about what takes place on it, or I'm not on TikTok, so I don't really care, right? But he's arguing in a lot of respects that we should understand and recognize TikTok as a platform's cultural power as being equal to, if not more substantial than, other established media industries like film, television, and radio in the United States. And so what he's getting at here is that when people argue that issues related to racism, related to cultural appropriation, regarding the credit given to creators, whatever it might be, when that is dismissed on TikTok, effectively what happens then is that Black creators are being told that the issues that affect them do not matter. And on top of that, the platform itself is sort of reifying that issue, because as he points to, when videos of D'Amelio circulate and her followers recreate quote unquote her dances, the cultural context of these dances is lost. That is, as the hashtag Renegade Challenge exploded in late fall 2020, for example, the context of the dance's origins and the anti-Blackness baked into its popularity were lost on the majority of TikTokers. Meanwhile, D'Amelio's celebrity skyrocketed as the dance she supposedly created became arguably TikTok's most famous dance challenge in the platform's short history. And so if we think about self-branding in regards to YouTube as being a practice by which girl creators were really pushed to think about themselves as creating an online self facilitated through their consumerist practices, like haul videos, like beauty tutorials, etc., right? With TikTok, we're seeing a slightly different phenomenon in which creators aren't necessarily pushed to create a persona anymore to maintain their audience, but instead they're really pushed to participate in using popular or trending sounds, to participate in doing dance challenges, though we don't see as many of them on the platform anymore, based in part on Black creators doing a kind of strike to take away their creative labor in the form of creating dances that were being attributed to white creators. But really what Buffoni is getting at here is that D'Amelio, by being a white girl creator on TikTok, was able to really benefit from the ways that the platform's user interface is designed in such a way that it makes it tricky to notice and properly attribute credit to the Black cultural creators who are doing the work that really sustains and pushes TikTok forward as a popular platform. And then as a result, Charli D'Amelio becomes a celebrity, and Black girl producers who are actually doing the creative labor that ultimately sustained and initiated her career don't get that same opportunity. And this culminates in what Buffoni identifies as the D'Amelio effect. And so he argues that the D'Amelio effect is something that he uses to encompass how the cultural production of teenage stars such as Charli D'Amelio influences the cultural actions of millions of teens and adults in the United States. And that she has a kind of unparalleled level of influence, and as a result dictates the culture of the app, including trending challenges, songs, and dances, not to mention her broader societal influence as a brand ambassador for companies such as Dunkin' Donuts. So if we think about this partnership that D'Amelio has with Dunkin' Donuts, and even other ways that she's gone on to monetize her self-brand, we can really recognize how TikTok still maintains this kind of consumerist logic or brand culture, in which for Charli D'Amelio to maximize or optimize her self-brand, she has to partially present her online self through the lens of being a consumer, right? Or kind of embedding herself in consumer culture that encourages her to really think about how she can place these goods and services into her own image. And so Buffoni argues that even though we might interpret TikTok as being inconsequential, because we could argue it's an escapist digital paradise, to some extent similar to what people sometimes argue about television or film, like prison media, right? He argues that it is very much part of the real world, and as such has a lasting influence on how whiteness is constructed in the United States in the TikTok age. And he especially puts forth the argument in the introduction, which we didn't get a chance to read, but I think kind of grounds a lot of these points that he's making, that the TikTok platform elevates videos made by white content creators in a way that promotes whiteness while obfuscating Blackness, and the cultural contributions of the Black artists who sing these songs and the Black dancers who choreograph the corresponding dance challenges. By this, I mean that TikTok as a platform, based on how it's designed, tends to elevate or amplify white creators like Charli D'Amelio, ultimately giving them the kind of power and platform and increased economic and social capital, right? So increased wealth and increased social status through their content creation and by working on their self-brand. But at the same time, they don't provide that same opportunity to Black creators because Black creators are not elevated and amplified on the platform in the same ways. This kind of connects then to thinking about Diana Zuli's article on capitalizing on the look. And this is an article that you may find in some places to be a little challenging, just because her writing style is a little more, I don't know what the word is that I'm looking for, but it sometimes can take a few moments to sort of get at what she's conveying, I guess is what I would say. So please do not panic if you're like, I'm struggling with this one a little bit. It is a little bit more challenging of a writing style. But sort of the key takeaways that I want to try to touch on before my voice gives out is that she differentiates between the gaze and the glance. And these two terms are really important to how she's thinking about Instagram as a platform. So whereas Trevor Buffoni is talking about TikTok and Sarah Benet Weiser, whose points that I synthesized for you is talking about YouTube, we can see with Diana Zuli, she's thinking about Instagram and social media influencing in that capacity. And so for her, a way to really understand the potential affordances of social media visibility on a platform like Instagram is by differentiating between the gaze and the glance. So she argues that the gaze is different because to gaze suggests that one lingers on the subject or object, looking for depth within the visual field. Gazing implies duration, time spent, and unhurried look. To gaze is to be intentional about looking and to consciously stare at an individual or object. Gazing is discriminate in that it only includes a certain image in the field of vision to the exclusion of other images. All right, so with the gaze, important takeaways is that with gazing, you are spending time doing this act, right? You are sort of dedicating a more significant amount of energy and time and attention to what it is that you're looking at, as opposed to this attention being short-lived or temporary, right? There's a kind of more sustained relationship between the person who is gazing and what it is or who it is that they are gazing at. An example of the gaze, and particularly we've kind of talked about or seen in media studies, an attention to the gaze of being the male gaze, meaning kind of the ways, for example, that female characters are portrayed in film and television and are meant to sort of be placed on screen in ways that are desirable to or meant for kind of men's view, right? So an example of this would be how Scarlett Johansson is filmed in Iron Man 2, which was released in 2010, versus how she is filmed in Black Widow, which was released in 2021. And if you watch these two films, or if you've already seen these two films, you can really see a difference in that in Iron Man 2, much of the way that the camera is oriented around Scarlett Johansson's body is very much kind of hypersexualizing her, right? So fight sequences are shown kind of, or are filmed from a low angle, and oftentimes are showing her butt from behind in ways that aren't necessarily necessary for a fight scene, right? You don't see the sort of same convention for the male fighters in those fight sequences. You'll also see a lot of situations in which she sort of leans over desks and there's kind of a sustained look at her breasts or a sustained look at her face in ways that are meant to sexualize her and really present her more as an object of desire for male viewers, right? And there's a kind of privileging in the male gaze of a heterosexual cis male gaze. By contrast, if you watch Black Widow, the filming style really doesn't perpetuate these same issues. Instead, we can really see that the gaze that is invited is one that is encouraging us to kind of recognize Black Widow as being a strong, empowered character and one who's really in control of her own narrative. And so if you have the time, I do encourage you to kind of watch these two films on Disney Plus and just kind of contradict or, compare and contrast, I should say, the different filming styles. Because when you really pay attention to sort of where the camera is focusing on Scarlett Johansson's body, how much of her body is in the frame of the camera, the frame being, kind of like a comics panel, this area right here, thinking about costuming choices and even dialogue, you can really see a stark contrast in, Iron Man 2 versus Black Widow. Now, if we contrast the gaze with the glance, which Diana Zuli wants us to do, she presents that one alternative perspective is the glance. Even though the glance appears to be a theoretical lightweight in comparison, and she's quoting someone here, Casey argues that the glance liberates individuals from the hegemonic control of the gaze. While the gaze establishes a clear imbalance of power, and this is important when we think back to this example I just provided of Black Widow versus Iron Man 2, The glance challenges the looker/look at dynamic because this relationship is often interchangeable. All individuals are theoretically active and agentic in the act of glancing. Furthermore, everyone already participates in the glance as it is the medium of human interaction. And so she goes on to say that since the glance is always in motion, the emphasis of the glance is on the connectivity of the look, not the depth of the look, as is the case with the gaze. Casey argues that the glance takes us to multiple surfaces and stimuli happening in the present time, whereas the gaze implies clear edges around the object, thus capturing the phenomenon itself. The glance eclipses edges as it moves among surfaces. That said, clinging to surfaces does not make the glance superficial. For the depth is in the connectivity of surfaces. Viewers simultaneously encounter the image/surface as is and its many associations with other images and contexts as well. So for Zuli, she's really getting at that there's sort of a more potentiality embedded in glancing than there is in gazing. For her, gazing is very strict, right? The person who is doing the gazing is looking at the other, and the other is not necessarily granted the opportunity to gaze back, right? There's an imbalance of power in the gaze. However, with the glance, Zuli argues that this is really relying on the connection between the viewer and the viewed, meaning that there's a way that the one who is being viewed can look back to or look back at the one who is viewing them, and instead creates a relationship between them that really kind of allows for a human connection between these 2 points. She really gets at kind of the nuances of these terms when she talks about attention economy and the glance. And so she says that, when we think about a social media platform like Instagram, right, this is where we can really understand that Instagram is derived from the process of glancing as opposed to gazing, okay? And so she kind of mentions this point that audiences perform a central economic activity while watching television and are thus aggregated commodities sold to advertisers. From this perspective, attending to mediated content is a capital enterprise. So what she means here, and kind of what she's citing at the beginning, is that what we watch is not inconsequential. Thus far, we've really focused on the representational power of viewership, right? That through watching, we can learn something about other communities, we can see ourselves represented, we can identify with characters, so on and so forth. But as the Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders on TV article kind of challenges us, right? Whereas for some folks, the issue is one of, if you don't see yourself represented, this can create a sense of lacking in cultural citizenship. What Zuli is getting at here is that when it comes to thinking about the importance of what we watch, part of the importance about that is that there are profits made off of where our attention goes, right? So shows that get more attention or kind of, higher viewership numbers are more likely to be renewed. Shows that have, less popularity, perhaps less social media traffic, are less likely to be renewed or less likely to have the same budget as a project that has that public support and attention, right? And so what she's asking us to really think about is how the ways we give attention to media translates to a profitability, but beyond that, also creates a kind of economic capital, right? And so advertisers, as well as creators of media content, really want to capitalize on where our attention goes by directing our attention at something that they themselves own and operate. So for social media influencers, what this means then is that successful users are those whose online activity garners attention from their followers and networks. So similar to television networks and film studios really wanting to sustain the attention of the viewer to their property, right? Social media influencers similarly also need to be able to sustain the connection between themselves and their viewers. And so this means that they have to make choices on sites like Instagram that really increase their visibility so as to maintain their connection with their audience. And so Zuli points out that the more likes, followers, and influence one has, the more valuable he or she becomes to potential advertisers. So based on the relationship or the parasocial relationship that exists between the social media influencer and their audience, ergo the glance that is exchanged between them, right, and the connectivity that occurs between them, this is going to create opportunities for influencers to increase their wealth or increase their economic capital, because their increased social capital of a heightened social standing that can translate to more value being perceived of them by influencers who might pay them to do a sponsorship or brand deal. And so all of this leads to this concept of attention economy, right? That I kind of synthesize as being that in the digital age, it refers to the ways in which a person's ability to focus on something like information, entertainment, or online content is considered a commodity that is limited in scope but highly desirable and sought after by entities like corporations, meaning that you can only direct your attention in so many places at once. And so advertisers and corporations really want to garner your attention and sustain it so that they can make the most money possible, right? And so similarly, part of what's embedded in self-branding or social media influencing is the necessity that there is a long-term sustained connection between the glance exchange between viewer and viewed, so as to maximize or optimize the visibility of the social media influencer within the attention economy. I'm going to pause to cough, then I will come right back. All right, this brings us to our final section of Internet Girlhood in the 2010s, from legacy media representations to digital self-images on social media. So a point that I wanted to emphasize here is that by engaging with this week's readings, viewings, and optional listen through the lens of social media influencing, we are working to recognize both the similarities and differences in self-mediated content creation posted to YouTube, Instagram, and that should say TikTok, not Twitter, in the 2010s and 2020s. And so what I mean by this is that when we talk about social media influencers, much like social media platforms, there's a tendency to sort of interpret this as very one-dimensional, right? That influencers all purportedly do one thing. There's not differences between them, but we want to really challenge that notion with our work this week, in part by considering how does the type of platform that an influencer is posting to inform the ways that they're making choices about how they self-mediate or how they self-represent to their audience. So we, of course, looked at videos from Emma Chamberlain, one of which was trying every coffee shop in LA. And one of the things that I wanted you to kind of pay attention to was thinking about kind of the setting for this video, right? The persona that's performed for the audience, the proximity between Emma Chamberlain and the camera, and, you know, by extension, her viewer, et cetera, the activities that were happening, so on and so forth, right? And with this video, we can really see that kind of the entirety of its plot is based on Emma is trying a bunch of different coffee shops in LA. And now for folks who are not as familiar with Emma's brand, right, you might think like, what is the purpose of this? Why would this be popular content? But for folks who are familiar with Emma, they would sort of have the existing context that so much of Emma's content is based around being like a relatable, normal girl, or at least her YouTube content is, right? So doing normal activities like going thrift shopping, doing crafts. Of particular interest for many folks when she started posting content was her, you know, leaving high school and spending more of her time doing different activities than maybe the average person who is of high school age would do, right? And in this particular video, we can really see a sustained glance between the creator and their audience, right? In the sense that if we use Diana Zuli's language of the glance, we can see how Emma is talking to the camera as if she is talking one-on-one with her audience, right? So she's really gesturing to the coffee that she's drinking. She's kind of dialoguing in ways that feel very personal and informal, right? She's not necessarily portraying herself in a way that suggests that she's not aware that there is an audience watching. Additionally, we can really see how her filming from her car also creates a kind of casual environment, much like we see on TikTok, that in later years kind of builds on the precedent established by online self-creation like we see on YouTube here. But what I'm really getting at is that Emma as a creator, right, her glance exchange with her audience is predicated on there being a kind of familiarity or almost parasocial friendship between the two of them. Now with my coffee recipe, which was the other YouTube video of hers that we watched, it's a little different, right? Here it's more of an instructional tutorial video where we still have Emma talking to the camera and talking to her viewer, but instead we also see some slight promotion for her coffee company, Chamberlain Coffee. Now, one of the reasons I chose this video is because I want you to really pay attention to how, you know, whereas in the previous video, she's filming from her car. Here, of course, we see Emma filming from her house, which is a consistent filming location for her videos on YouTube. But what's particularly interesting is that in thinking about the kind of formula for this video is being pretty consistent with what beauty gurus and wellness gurus posted to YouTube in the 2010s. What Emma effectively does with this video is kind of embed or build in branding culture into her video by way of talking about herself as a business owner, an entrepreneur, a creator of this coffee company, right? Simultaneous to her also presenting herself as a regular girl to her audience. And so if we think then about Sarah Benet Weiser's point that girls on YouTube who are pushed to self-brand so as to maximize their economic and social capital are doing so in ways that also embed them in a larger brand culture, we can really see how the process of consuming coffee or drinking coffee, right, becomes so central to Emma's online persona, and then ultimately then contributes to what she chooses to expand into as a social media influencer who's creating a brand based off of this online persona. And of course, when we think about Emma Chamberlain, whether you're familiar with her or not, she's a very popular YouTuber who has since expanded beyond the platform. And whereas Emma, of course, if you see kind of earlier in her content versus kind of later in her content, we see slight evolutions in her appearance in the sense that she's now sort of more embedded in traditional magazine publishing culture, in the sense that she's been invited to numerous fashion weeks and she really participates in kind of mainstream, high scale, fashion shows based on her increased social capital. But at the same time, through her YouTube, she attempts to situate herself still as kind of a regular girl who, despite having this increased social capital, simultaneously maintains her status as a regular person that her viewers can still connect with and relate to, right? Now, at the same time, Emma Chamberlain moving to LA and having evolutions in her content, such as buying, a really fancy house and attending these upscale events, has also really challenged her connection with her viewers, because these changes to her branding and persona have also meant that some viewers feel like they can't relate as much, right? Because they don't live in the same house, they don't go to the same events, they don't have the same sort of relatable experience or life experience as Emma any longer. But even still, we can see how traditional industries like fashion and marketing really seek after a girl YouTuber and social media influencer like Emma Chamberlain, based in part on the kind of increased and sustained connectivity or glancing that is exchanged between herself and her audience. You also had an optional podcast listen from Anything Goes with Emma Chamberlain. And I don't have the strength to go into this in as much depth as I would like to, but I would like you to reflect on, if you did have a chance to listen to it, to think about how Emma builds in personal narrative as one of the techniques that she uses to convey her argument or her point. But also I want you to really think about how, even if you do a quick scroll through the other episodes that are included in this podcast, the types of topics that she talks on, and how through this podcast, she in some respects kind of tries to still maintain a comparable persona to what she has on YouTube versus in, the mainstream media. And we can really see the evolution in her online presence if you look at kind of the combination of her Instagram and her YouTube, particularly since her TikTok is not active anymore and was very short-lived. But you can really see how kind of when you scroll through her Instagram and even look at her presentation on YouTube channels like that of Harper's Bazaar and Vogue, it's a very different self-presentation than what we get of her on her own channel, where she sort of presents herself more so as the quirky regular girl who drinks coffee and doesn't do much, right? And so there's sort of these two contrasting personas that in some respects Emma has really tried to blend over time to kind of varying effectiveness. Similarly, when we think about other influencers who come after Emma Chamberlain, such as Charli D'Amelio, Dixie D'Amelio, and Addison Rae, of course, these are influencers whose fame originates on TikTok. And importantly, when we talk about social media, we want to really distinguish TikTok from other platforms, in part because the kind of fame that people achieve on TikTok is quite different from what's achieved on YouTube or Instagram. So whereas Diana Zuli's article, Capitalizing on the Look, helps us to understand that the dynamic between the social media influencer and their audience on Instagram is really predicated on that sustained glance, right? And remaining competitive within the attention economy. And Sarah Benet Weiser's findings also help us to understand that YouTube is really persona driven, embedded in a consumer brand culture. TikTok is drawing from these spaces, but doing so differently, right? As I mentioned in thinking about Trevor Buffoni's chapter, with TikTok, creators are more so kind of, jumping on challenges, they are participating in trending sounds and reactions and whatever else, dances, right? But their kind of approach to achieving visibility is more so based on appearing on the For You page, which is a much different task than sustaining an audience, right? And so even though these creators do ultimately build an audience on a platform like TikTok that can translate to increased social capital so they, appear on mainstream legacy spaces like, Vogue's YouTube channel or on late night talk shows. At the same time, the way that they're presenting themselves on TikTok in short form content is more often than not based on kind of the activities that they're doing that are trending and are popular on the platform and therefore palatable to the algorithm in ways that are different from long form content on YouTube or static image content on Instagram, both of which really necessitate that the creator has a sustained connection with their audience. Whereas for these creators on TikTok, they don't necessarily have to acquire the same type of connection to be visible on the platform. And you really see kind of in the Bustle interview with Addison Rae, where she kind of talks about the evolution of her career. And I really wanted to bookmark just how quick this evolution is. And if we think back to Trevor Buffoni's point about the way that white creators are elevated and amplified on TikTok, Addison Rae is a really good example of this, of how quickly she was able to grow in size in terms of her platform with TikTok and how that translated into other opportunities like a music career, which we see other creators like Dixie D'Amelio also trying to do. And while we see a kind of stigma associated with like TikTok musicians, right, or TikTok artists, or this idea of like everyone releases music as soon as they gain some popularity, whereas we see that backfiring with someone like Dixie D'Amelio, who got a lot of pushback for her song like Be Happy, and filming it in this large scale mansion. By contrast, we see a creator like Bella Porch, who, when actually putting in a substantial amount of effort and work into the music video concept, as well as the production of the song, we can see that it's sort of more so recognized by the public that it's an exception to the rule, as opposed to being consistent that music created by TikTokers is of quality. Additionally, we really see the transition of TikTokers and internet celebrities moving into mainstream media beyond just, late night talk show appearances and magazine YouTube channels. We see the onset of the D'Amelio Show, which is a reality show on Hulu, the remake of She's All That for Netflix called He's All That, which featured Addison Rae, and the very not well-received reality show Hype House for Netflix. That is probably one of the worst reality shows I've watched. But in each case, nonetheless, we really can see a way in which once they've acquired internet celebrity status, social media influencers, and just even TikTokers, YouTubers, and Instagram celebrities, right, are able to really optimize or leverage their kind of high follower count and increase social status to achieve other legacy media industry opportunities, like being on a TV show that can further advance their, economic capital and other forms of celebrity status. Now, by contrast, of course, and this is kind of by now a really well-known counterexample, we see the case of Jalea Harmon, who was the creator of The Renegade. And we saw kind of a profile in the New York Times by Taylor Lorenz that really brought to light the ways that TikTok has done so much work to elevate and amplify white creators, and simultaneously has done very little to support Black creators. Just as kind of a point of comparison, so Jalea Harmon, who again was the original creator of The Renegade, has 2.9 million followers on TikTok and 625,000 followers on Instagram. And when I last taught this class in fall 2021, her follower count in both cases was pretty much the same as what's represented here. By contrast, Charli D'Amelio has 141.1 million followers on TikTok and 48.6 million followers on Instagram. When I last taught this class, her TikTok followers were more so in like the 120 something million realm, and the Instagram followers was in like the, I think, 45 something million realm, which is to say that Charli D'Amelio's followers have since grown even more, whereas Jalea Harmon's have really not changed in just, the less than a year since I've taught this class. And so when we really think then about the differences here, we can recognize Jalea Harmon as being a Black girl who created, and acts as a cultural producer, a creative laborer on TikTok, who's contributing a challenge like The Renegade that, of course, really changed and transformed the careers of white TikTokers like Charli D'Amelio, without which she wouldn't have a career, right? But we still don't see a kind of parity in terms of Jalea Harmon having the same social status or economic capital as we see with Charli D'Amelio. We definitely see a change in that social status and economic capital, but it was more so, again, kind of an exceptional case in which, based on the controversies around her not getting the credit she deserves, she acquired more of that visibility. Whereas Charli D'Amelio, as a white creator, can really achieve this without having to be the creative visionary that Jalea Harmon is. I encourage you to watch this video that features Jalea Harmon. It's from Nightline in 2021. And I think that this is a really good look at sort of the issues that persist when it comes to Black girl cultural producers like Jalea Harmon. And I would encourage you to especially end with this, because I think it's important to keep in mind that when we're talking about overrepresentation and underrepresentation as ongoing concepts for our use, we can also consider hypervisibility and undervisibility, or lack of visibility, as being another dynamic in which, once again, we see the issue of, creators of color not achieving the kind of comparable success that they should deserve and should acquire by doing the actual creative labor that ultimately platforms other creators who aren't doing that same labor. Sorry, I had to cough one last time. All right, so that is everything that I have for you today in English 2367. Thank you so much for making it to this point in the lecture, and I'm so sorry for my crackly little voice. Let's hope in week 5 that I am back in business and not sounding like this. But please know that I appreciate you. I appreciate all of the great work that you're doing in this class. And as always, please reach out if you have any questions, comments, concerns, or just things that you need support with. I am more than happy to be of help. All right, everybody, have a wonderful week, and I hope that you are doing all right.